we live as people who are really less peculiar than we should be in the culture. Instead, we've become Christian assimilationists who look largely like everyone else but claim that we follow Jesus. That burns, right? I want to talk to you today and next week about minding the gap. I think there is often a gap for many of us, including pastors, by the way, in our church life or our faith or however you'd like to refer to that and the rest. We may have boxes, we may have categories that things go in. We may keep things compartmentalized. But the interesting part is that I'm not sure that we start out doing this. It could be just a pastor's kid thing, but I have, for example, I've walked outside as my daughter is playing with her friend, and one day I walk out there and they're sitting and they're playing with dolls and everything, but as I listen closely to the conversation, they're talking theology. They're sitting there and they're talking, and Allie is telling her about how Jesus died and where is God and where is heaven. Questions I can't answer, right? Or another time we were at Dana's parents' house and everybody was in the pool and I had been inside for a minute. I come outside and Dana's sister informs me that Braden had just gotten finished giving everyone their religion lesson, as she referred to it. So I'm not sure we start off with this gap. It's actually later, especially when we become teenagers, that we kind of keep these things separate. You may have heard stories of horrified teenagers when their youth minister shows up at school or something like that. You know, the worlds have collided and no, I have these different compartments. But kids, have you ever noticed children will just talk? There's no filter. They'll just talk about whatever's on their mind. That's dangerous sometimes, I know. But they'll talk about whatever they've been learning and whatever is exciting them at the time. We develop a gap later on. There's a book called The Monday Connection. It was written by William Deal, no relation to Reagan's brother. It's a different spelling. The Monday Connection, he starts out in this book talking about how he remembers his childhood, and the confusion for him began early on with the connection between Sunday and Monday. Here's what he says near the beginning of the book. My grandparents on both sides of the family were regular churchgoers, but I never saw how it made any difference in their daily lives. Not once did I see any of my parents or grandparents pray outside of a church service. At mealtimes, it was always Billy who was expected to recite his little prayer. A parent would usually say my bedtime prayer with me when I was very young, but I have no idea if they prayed before their own bedtime. We never discussed religion at our dinner table, which we all know you can't do because it started a food fight, right? It seemed to me that my parents' and grandparents' religious experience was confined to what went on in church on Sunday morning. That's what he observes. What about you? I have an image for you. Is your faith the hub or a spoke of the wheel? Think about a bicycle wheel. The spokes are all connected to the hub, and they do whatever the hub does. When the hub spins, they spin. Where the hub and the rest of the bike goes, they go. The hub is the central controlling part. Now, what's tricky about this is that we all have a hub, whether we know it or not. Our lives have some kind of hub, even if we haven't identified it. And the question is, what is it? I have a helpful illustration here for those of you who don't know what a tire looks like when it's spinning. You know, the hub is going to control everything else. Where does faith fall for you? And is there confusion? If someone were to say to you, faith should be the center of your life, do you then think, I can't be in church that often? Is that what we mean? Or how about this image? Believer or disciple? You know, a believer, if you believe, you might identify with the team, wear the uniform. but are you out there making the plays? You noticed I picked the right football team on the right-hand side there. It's that season. There was a preacher at the annual gathering this year, the Central Region annual gathering, and he used this distinction, believer versus disciple. He talked about what it must have been like for the men who took Jesus down from the cross. They said, these men, Joseph of Arimathea and the others, when they took him down, they would have gotten his blood and his bodily fluids and everything all over them, right? And he says, a believer is someone with Jesus on the inside of them. A disciple is someone with Jesus all over the outside of them for everyone to see. Jesus called us to make disciples in the Great Commission. Go into all the world and make disciples. When he first started out, when he first called his disciples, he said, "Follow me." But here's what this author says. He says, I knew all that, but it was hard. I didn't have any practical guidance for doing this, he says. For him, it wasn't the want to, it was the know-how. Here's what he says later in the book. There was a problem, a major problem. My Sunday experience had no connection to my Monday world. The words that came to me from the Bible and the pulpit made no sense to me in my weekday world. William Deal was a salesman for the Bethlehem Steel Corporation for most of his career. And he remembers, and on Sunday he would hear passages like, you're supposed to forgive your brother 77 times. And he would say, how do I do that as a businessman? I can't forgive debt 77 times. I'll go out of business. And he had questions like that. For him, it wasn't the want to, it was the know-how. And he said, this is the part that got my attention, his pastor was of no help to him. But he knew that he needed to find a way because of verses like the ones we read. Matthew 5:13-16. You are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. Let your light so shine before men so that they may see your good works and what? Glorify your Father in heaven. And then the other verse we read, it ends with 1 John 2:6. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. I remember the first time I read that verse because it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was 19 years old, youth minister in Chase City, Virginia. I'd never heard of the place either until I went there. And that's the first time I read this verse. I still remember it because it hit me so hard. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. We claim it, we have to live it. But William Deal said, I just didn't know how to do that. I faced problems in my daily life. I did not know how to apply my faith, my Sunday faith, to my Monday world. So here's what I've done. I've cooked up a 2-part sermon for you this week and next week, and I'm going to suggest 5 practical ways that we can incorporate our faith into our daily life. I'm going to go all practical on you this month, which is probably what we're supposed to do all the time. 5 practical ways, 3 today, 2 next week. Number 1, do your work well. This is adapted from William Deal's book. If you were to pick up his book, it would be somewhat different from what I'm telling you. Number 1, do your work well. Let's call it the ministry of competence. Whatever you do, whether you're working, whether you're retired, whatever it is, whatever you do it well. At the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis, we're told actually that we are co-laborers with God. Genesis 2:15 says that the Lord God took man, put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. Right from the beginning, we're not just God's little minions running around. We are co-laborers with God in our work in the world. And there's a great verse in the book of Colossians, chapter 3. It says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as if working for the Lord and not for men. Whatever you do it for the Lord. If you're retired and you now volunteer and do part-time or full-time grandparenting, do it for the Lord. If you're in business or service or an educator or a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it may be, do it for the Lord. If you spend all day on Facebook, bust that thing up with a holy purpose. Do it for the Lord. Whatever you do, Colossians says, do it as if for the Lord. Susan Gillies of the American Baptist Home Mission Society says something very interesting about this. She asks us to picture ourselves at the water cooler at the office. And she says, you know, if you think about it, it's the people who do good, hard, competent work who are more likely to get leeway from the boss about spending an extra 10 minutes at the water cooler with that distressed coworker. Or she says, if you are known to do good, competent work, you will have more opportunities for influence, both personally and professionally. It's interesting, isn't it? Think about it. If you're known to be lazy and you want to take a minute to try to minister to someone who's having a rough time, it's not going to go over too well. But if you're known to be a good hard worker, you might have an opportunity to take advantage of. Do good work, William Deal says. Number 2, be tuned in. Let's call it a ministry of presence. Before he went to work for the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, William Deal worked as a combat medic with the United States military. And he talked about how he always had to have his radio on. But there was a lot that came over the radio, a lot of noise and a lot of stuff that wasn't relevant to him. He always had to be tuned in for the call for help. You get where I'm going? There's so much noise and gobbledygook out there, but he had to tune it. He had to always have his radio on, and he had to stay tuned in to make sure he heard when a distress call or a call for help came out. How many of those have we missed? How many times have you sent out a distress call and nobody was tuned in? James chapter 1 tells us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. You remember the thing we tell kids? You have 2 ears, 1 mouth. Listen. Be tuned in. Don't miss someone's distress call in the midst of all the other noise. You know, there are listening skills, the 5 basic listening skills that counselors and others talk about. Listening is actually an active thing. You know, hearing we don't have to try, right? Just sound hits our eardrums. Listening is an active process. And here's what they normally say, you know, focus on the person that is talking to you. Acknowledge them verbally and non-verbally. Invite them to share. You know how it is. You're in a conversation with maybe an acquaintance, you're not a best friend or anything like that, and you're trying to take cues on how much you can share, right? Invite. And number 4 is really the key for me. Summarize. When you listen to someone talk, repeat back to them what you heard them saying they're feeling and struggling with. You know how powerful it is to have your own feelings repeated back to you? That's normally not what happens. You either have people argue with you or they tell you not to feel that way, right? It's a powerful thing to have your feelings repeated back to you. And finally, ask for more. Be interested. Be tuned in. Listen for the distress calls. So, do your work well. Be tuned in. And number 3, last one for today, follow the golden rule. The golden rule, that thing that everybody knows but nobody does, right? Treat others as you would have them treat you, even if they don't treat you the way you would have them treat you. That's hard to do. Philippians 2 says this, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Speaking of noise, there is a lot of noise out there that's going to tell you over and over again to look out for your own interests. We all need to turn some of that stuff off and just open the Bible. We'd be better people. Consider others better than yourselves. William Deal in his book tells a neat story about when he was promoted. He got promoted, he went to a different part of the office where he worked, and he noticed that the secretaries were very intent on the coffee. Secretary, first thing when they come in the morning, they make coffee. They check it mid-morning. They check it again at lunchtime. Always make sure there was coffee there. Now, granted, that's important. Coffee. But he says that through conversation with them, he realized that their last boss had made that a point, that they were there to wait on him. And one of the big things was the coffee. You know what he said to them? I can make my own coffee. You are professionals, and I'm going to treat you that way. Imagine the difference that made and the lines of communication that were open just because he had more respect for them than their previous boss. Just because he recognized the golden rule told him, if you don't want to be the coffee slave, don't make somebody else the coffee slave. Restaurants. We all eat in restaurants. Have you ever gotten bad service? So what? I mean, think about it. Were we put on this earth to be served, or were we put on this earth to love our neighbor? If you're getting bad service, one of two things is probably true. Either the server is having a bad day, or they don't know what they're doing. Either way, it's not going to help them if I'm a jerk. Love your neighbor. If you're getting bad service, they probably need it more than anyone. I mean, think about it. Have you ever, I know that when the restaurant's busy, it's a lost cause. But have you ever had the opportunity to get to know your server just a little bit? Their name, what they do outside of serving, what maybe one hobby. Have you ever done that? Or, let me really blow your mind, have you ever asked how you can pray for your server? I know, it's crazy. How can I pray for you? Or write a note on their receipt and leave a good tip. I used to have a campus minister who would tell me your tips say more about you than they do the service. I want to share a story that's always inspired me. In this next picture, you'll see at least 4 gentlemen who are no longer with us. These are the Romeos. For a long time, they've met at Denny's at Wanamaker for every Friday for a long time. And they had the same waitress for a long time. And it got to the point where they didn't have to order. The waitress knew what they wanted, right? And they got to know each other, and they talked and, cut up every week. And one time, after getting to know the server, they learned that she had a dream. She really wanted to go to nursing school. But you're not going to save up enough money for that if you're waitressing unless you're willing to take on a lot of debt. And so they ended up taking up a collection for her. And I don't know exactly when this was, but they took up a collection, presented it to her one morning, and said, "This is for nursing school." And it blew her away. But they weren't done. I also understand that when they learned that that waitress was leaving the restaurant, quitting, going somewhere else. They presented her with a bouquet of flowers and another collection that they had taken up. Now, there's a waitress who knows who Christians are. Do you know that it's well known among waiters and waitresses that you don't want to work on Sunday afternoon? Ask them. That's when the church people come to get food, and they can be nasty and entitled. But this waitress, because of their simple witness, it's going to take a lot for her to have a negative opinion of Christianity. Here's one of my favorite quotes these days. It's on my office door. Christian theology, at its best, insists that the key point is not what makes us persons, but who makes us persons. The problem with focusing on what makes us persons, whether it is our rationality or our call to be responsible, is that anyone who lacks any of these criteria can be removed from human consideration. He says, because we know God and because we know that it's who makes us persons, we don't get to treat anyone as less than human. We don't get to treat anyone as not worthy of respect because God has endowed them with their worth. So there may be some very simple ways, some very simple opportunities right under our noses to move from believer to disciple, to get out and make a few plays. So, do your work well. Ministry of competence, let's call it. Be tuned in. A ministry of presence, let's call it. And obey the golden rule. A ministry of respect, let's call it. Next week, 4 and 5.